Hello again, and welcome to the Castle Old Skull Hawk Moor project, where we explore the deepest roots of Dungeons & Dragons in search of greater understanding and forgotten details that we can use to move forward into the future of old-school-inspired game design. The Hawk Moor project celebrates the world of Greyhawk as created by Gary Gygax, as well as the world of Blackmoor, as created by Dave Arneson and all of their gaming friends and co-creators. Today, we are discussing Gary Gygax's early fan appreciation for Tolkien, The Hobbit, and Middle-earth. When it comes to Gary Gygax's feelings about JRR Tolkien and Middle-earth, most people remember that he was irritated whenever gamers believed, quite rightly they believed, that a significant chunk of early 1970s Dungeons & Dragons was extremely derivative of the good professor's works. Gary became especially frustrated when people would take him to task for not following Tolkien's world building all the way. For example, when Gygax borrowed Poul Anderson's regenerating trolls idea from 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, instead of following Tolkien's texts on trollkind being slow and bungling and turning to stone in the sunshine, people wrote complaining letters that Gygax's Dungeons & Dragons game was incorrect. Needless to say, Gary never found this to be amusing. As an idea creator and game designer, Gary always preferred a synthesist approach, taking elements from many different sources and then providing concrete measures for monstrous size, distance, time, relative power, hierarchies, orders, classifications, and so forth, to similar ideas which he had culled from other authors and creators' prior works. This measuring synthesis is one of the ingenious hallmarks of Dungeons & Dragons. It turns abstract ideas into workable, game-worthy statistics. And it is also the undeniable essence of the famous quote, "Good artists borrow, but great artists steal." This synthesist approach is not just theft, however, because Gary created something entirely new from out of his thousands of inspirations. And this methodology and creativity certainly makes Dungeons & Dragons a central touchstone between many hundreds of other imaginary worlds. But this method of derivative design also provides clear and undeniable strains of creative DNA, which we can inevitably follow up into the original sources that Gary used with varying, yet sometimes highly provocative, degrees of success. Gary never seemed to like it when I and other hardcore Dungeons & Dragons history fans would tug at these ancient threads in the creative tapestry. Peeking in at the working wizard behind the curtain made him uncomfortable. But that is a topic for another day. Later in life, whenever fans asked Gary about Tolkien and Dungeons & Dragons, he would tend to take the route of saying there were actually many influences, while then turning to discussing the equal importance of Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, Poul Anderson, Jack Vance, Abraham Merritt, H.P. Lovecraft, Lord Dunsany, and so on and so forth. All of which is true, but the deflected fact remains that Chainmail's fantasy supplement of 1971 is basically a Battle of the Pelennor Fields and Battle of the Five Armies Middle-earth war simulator with only a few elementals, spells, and other fantasy influences from outside thrown in for good measure. In Chainmail, for example, we find the Nazgul, hobbits, ents, wizards, the great red dragon Smaug, the Balrog, orcs of Mordor and Isengard, wargs, Barrow-wights, and much more besides. The earlier your edition of Chainmail is, the more apparent that these direct and admiring tributes to Professor Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Fellowship of the Ring become. Consider, for example, the following quote from Gary in early chainmail. He said, "We will deal here with the great red dragon, Draco Conflagratio, or Draco Horribilis, which is typified in Tolkien's The Hobbit." Unquote. And on another page, another interesting quote directly from Tolkien's world building. Gary wrote, "According to the best authority, there are at least 5 kinds, tribes, or perhaps clans of them," meaning the orcs. These are orcs of the Red Eye, orcs of Mordor, orcs of the mountains, orcs of the White Hand, and Isengarders. It can therefore be assumed that if there are 2 or more units of orcs, they will be from differing bands. Unquote. These shoutouts were harmless in 1971, but by the mid-1970s, TSR was a big multi-million-dollar business. The Tolkien borrowing became a threat to Middle-earth's commercial prospects when the animated version of The Hobbit was set to premiere on television. After Mr. Sol Zaentz and Tolkien Enterprises threatened TSR with a lawsuit due to the many similarities evident in original Dungeons & Dragons and other related works, this, by the way, took place in 1977, the upcoming Monster Manual hardcover from TSR was necessarily delayed from its expected publication. Its final pre-publication draft was filled with Ents, Hobbits, Balrogs, and all the rest. TSR had to go to federal court, the Milwaukee branch in Wisconsin, in December to admit wrongdoing for settlement, and was thereby encouraged to prepare for a full cleansing, let's say a scouring of the Shire basically, in regard to its ongoing and future publications. By agreement thereafter, TSR could sell the remaining stock of infringing products, such as the Battle of Five Armies TSR boxed game, through the end of the first quarter of 1978. But then they also needed to labor responsibly toward cleansing future game editions of any remaining vestiges which echoed Tolkien's specific intellectual property. Before we all feel too sorry for TSR at this time, we will also remember that they were simultaneously skimping on Dave Arneson's royalties, unfairly and loudly shouting about copyrights, and also picking on other budding games such as Tunnels and Trolls. So we won't cry too much about TSR's legal growing pains here. There were many such legal controversies that we can explore in future episodes of Hawk Moor if there is further listener interest. Gary later summarized this very messy time period as follows. Note that in this extended quotation, I have cleaned up Gary's spelling and formatting and also added a few words for explanatory context. The general quote is as follows. TSR was served with papers threatening damages to the tune of $500,000 by the Sol Zaentz division of Elon Merchandising on behalf of the Tolkien estate. The main objection was to the board game we were publishing, Battle of the Five Armies. The author of that game, Larry Smith, had given us at TSR a letter from his attorney claiming that the work was grandfathered because it was published after the copyrights for JRR Tolkien's works had lapsed and before any renewals were made. The action also demanded we remove Balrog, Dragon, Dwarf, Elf, Ent, Goblin, Hobbit, Orc, and Warg from the Dungeons & Dragons game. Although only Balrog and Warg were actually unique names, we agreed to Hobbit as well. We at TSR kept the rest of the names, of course. The board game was dumped, and thus the suit was settled out of court at that. Gary's view of Tolkien's works quickly soured after that. to the point where he became annoyed for decades whenever anyone asked him about these obvious Middle-earth influences on his game. Beginning in December 1977, Dungeons & Dragons was haphazardly de-Tolkienized, but only to the point that the most glaring infringements were turned into mythological or folkloric equivalents or unique original creatures. Hobbits, for example, became halflings. Ents became Trents. Balrogs became Baelors, the Type 6 demons, with only one being randomly named Baelor, as in Irish mythology. No wraiths in D&D were Nazgul any longer, and the most immense giant eagles became mostly rocks inspired by the Arabian Nights, and so on. The sad thing is, Gary was actually quite a loving fan of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, at least up until the end of the Mines of Moria chapters. He found it boring after that. Before he published Chainmail, he was actually quite a devotee of the idea of Tolkien-inspired Middle-earth fantasy wargaming. We can explore Gary's early fandom of Middle-earth during this episode of Hawk Moor. One of the most interesting early aspects of Gygax's Middle-earth fandom can be found in issues of the 1969 and 1970 fan-published amateur magazine, or fanzine, which is entitled Thangorodrim. You can find a few archived issues of this curious work hidden away in a dragon's cave if you care to scour the internet in various places. I'll leave you to that treasure hunt yourself. Volume 1, Issue Number 2, from August 1969, features an illustrated dragon on the cover that is playfully named by Thangorodrim's editor, Bill McDuffie, as, quote, Gary Gygax, alias Smog. Yes, there are good worms, too. That's right. In 1969, Gary was proud and happy to be associated with Smog, the Red Dragon of Middle-earth. We must remember, of course, that fantasy role-playing games did not fully exist yet. This magazine is therefore mostly about diplomacy variants, where the rules of diplomacy are slightly restructured and the map of the game is thematically altered to pay tribute to some other culture, genre, historical age, or imaginary world. Gary at this time, for example, the summer of 1969, was embroiled in postally mailed move orders for the Scotomancy Scotland variant in play, which dealt with the historical Scottish clans. He played as Clan MacDonald, by the way, for those keeping score at home. He also simultaneously played the Native American Indianomancy variant of diplomacy as the Dakota tribe. His buddy and rival, Len Lakofka, was an opponent in both games. Notably, this issue of Thangorodrim number 2 is also obliquely telling us about how to turn the game of diplomacy into an endless series of wars of Middle-earth variants. There was a Middle-earth Diplomacy 4 campaign going on, for example, along with Mordor vs. the World number 3 and Third Age. In other words, gamers around the world were trying to push the boundaries of diplomacy's proto-role-playing metagame straight into the world of Tolkien fantasy. In that way, bold Middle-earth variants were already becoming a thing. The rules in this issue for the Third Age game, which are authored by Brian Libby, already include some interesting proto-role-playing elements. For example, the influence of the Steward of Gondor, Elvish names for months and turns, secret movement for the Ring-Bearer against the forces of darkness, and the magical powers of the One Ring itself. Gary Gygax would certainly be following these new gaming innovations with great interest, and he would be designing his own chainmail fantasy game a little over a year later with much of this in mind. Things get even more interesting in Thangorodrim issue number 3, from around September of 1969, where we find Gary authoring a new dragon-themed series of articles for Thangorodrim's readership. This series of articles was entitled Great Worms. We learn here a bit about Gary's creative envisioning of the ways of the frost drakes residing in Middle-earth. I believe players of Dungeons & Dragons will find this very interesting because this is the origin of the White Dragon. To quote, "Perhaps the rarest of the great worms is the Arctic dragon, or frost breath. Unlike others of his kind, this large white worm inhabits only the coldest regions of the far north and has no internal fire. Draco Arcticus seeks glaciers in which to dwell, and if the temperature remains cold enough, they will remain sleeping therein for very long periods of time, only awakening to feed when stimulated by warmth. The Arctic dragon will attack any living creature on sight, often including others of its own species. Their main weapon is a chilling breath, which will immediately freeze boiling water. All recorded specimens have only a single head and are up to 100 feet in length. They weigh 8 tons and otherwise conform to dragons in general, with wings, fangs, claws, etc. Arcticus does not usually hoard treasure and is of low intelligence." I made some slight corrections in that quote to clarify bits. This early bit of creative writing is quite revealing when we compare it to the later versions of the White Dragon in D&D, particularly that featured in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual of December 1977. For D&D, Gary toned down the size of all the dragons. I don't really know why, but at a guess, it was probably to ensure that they could fit into dungeons with 10-foot wide corridors and narrow caves, or perhaps to make them small enough so that parties of adventurers would actually stand a chance against them. Over the decades, many people have harped on Gary's design decision and now insist that dragons should be much bigger. For those people, you can now slap up some stats to see how they feel about a 100-foot-long ancient white dragon. At scale, according to my calculations, that would be about 25 hit dice. These dragons innately detect warmth and instantly attack on sight with no chance for negotiations. A few other pieces of White Dragon lore did secretly make their way from Gary's Middle-earth to D&D. These details, of course, were the coloration, habitat, frost breath, and lower intelligence. We note, too, that although Dungeons & Dragons White Dragons are not poor, they certainly have much smaller treasure hoards than other dragons do. This was only the beginning of a quite intriguing series of exploratory creative works. Gary was writing and growing restless with the limitations of diplomacy and its variants. And while that game could be used far beyond its original intent to emulate Middle-earth to some degree, there was no new official lore defining the denizens of that world. The Great Worms articles might have been Gary's personal attempt to gauge the interest of other fantasy game designers in regard to further innovations in designing a shared imaginary milieu of heroes and dragons. If only there was some kind of game where such ideas could be fully explored. Gary and Dave Arneson, of course, would have to create this game later on their own. Such a game would absolutely need to be differentiated and have interesting dragons of its own. Lots of dragons. In later Thingorgrim issues, Gary would further design his earliest versions of Middle-earth's black dragons, green dragons, blue dragons, and the dragon-like purple worm. We will continue to explore these fascinating details in our next episode as we warily proceed in silence away from the cavern of Draco Arcticus, heading southward toward much warmer, if not more peaceful climes. We will explore these other intriguing secrets and Gary's love for Middle-earth another time. Till then, stay alive in the dragon-haunted wilderlands and stay tuned. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next episode of Hawk Moor.